The US has controversially flown 2 batches of deportees to Africa. Most of them are not Africans. The first batch landed in South Sudan in early July. This week, another batch was offloaded in Eswatini. The Africa-bound deportees are convicted criminals whose countries have refused to take them back. Yet, in the backdrop of widespread domestic outrage, the US Supreme Court has authorized Trump's populist election policy, mass deportation of immigrants. This week on the program, we ask, why are African countries accepting deported convicts of foreign extractions? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. And joining me now to unpack the situation of undocumented immigrants in America and the legality of their deportation to Africa are, in studio here with me, Hassan Kanenje, Director of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. In Kampala in Uganda, David Monda, Professor of Political Science Department at City University of New York. And from Johannesburg via Zoom, Kandala Lupwana, international law expert. A very warm welcome to you all, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us in this discussion. David, in Kampala, let me start off with you, because U.S. authorities have deported largely non-African migrants to South Sudan and Eswatini in the ongoing crackdown on undocumented immigrants. First of all, paint for us a picture of what's going on in the U.S. regarding these deportations.
The situation in the U.S. right now is very much anti-immigrant. I think Donald Trump, on his campaign platform, declared a very robust initiative to remove the over 12 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. So it started with ICE, the immigration department, going very aggressively to deport those who are in removal proceedings. They've been taking undocumented immigrants out of their court hearings. Once they are done with them, people are being taken out of schools, hospitals, even in some situations. A couple months ago, we remember the situation where the U.S. Marines and the California National Guard were deployed in Los Angeles to physically remove thousands of immigrants. We also see the expedited process of removal of undocumented immigrants to countries which were not of their origin. So this is also another very complicated, challenging issue that not only violates the U.S. Constitution, but also international law and the conventions to which the U.S. is party to. So I think very broadly, not only at a domestic level within the states, but in an international context, Trump has been very aggressive and very anti-immigrant.
How are U.S. authorities, though, going about tracking down the undocumented immigrants? And what happens to them after they are arrested?
Several things can happen. What the Trump administration has been targeting most specifically is undocumented immigrants, which means most of these are actually visa overstays, right? So 60 to 70% of the undocumented immigrants in the U.S. are people that came on short-term visas, but they overstayed those visas. So to answer your question, how the Trump administration has been approaching this is to go after those undocumented immigrants that have felony cases, you know, so they have cases pending in court, they committed felonies, those are the #1 targets. And as I said, the ICE tactic has been, the immigration and customs enforcement tactic has been to go outside of courtrooms where they know these immigrants will be coming to have their cases heard, you know, in regards to their deportation status or their appeals for asylum. And immediately once the hearing is done, these individuals will be rounded up and put in detention facilities. And they'll be doing expedited processes to remove them from the country, which also, you know, denies them their legal due process rights, because they have a right to appeal their deportations. Right. And what the Trump administration is really trying to do is to short-circuit that, to expedite the process of their removal.
So, Dr. Kanenje, I want to bring this to Africa for the moment. What are your thoughts, though, on the deportation of what we're seeing as criminals to the continent?
Actually shocking, especially in the 21st century, that is akin to what the colonizers, dumped convicts, like for instance, the British dumping convicts in Australia, and they did horrible things to the natives. This is not something that actually countries should be entertaining. But, what is being seen as, the United States striking a deal or the Trump administration, these are not deals, because it's akin to dumping your trash in the neighbor's yard and then using blackmail as a strategy to achieve that. And so it is an unprecedented, action that sets extremely bad precedents, not just because it goes against international law, but it goes against all the practices as we know them in terms of justice and human rights in the 21st century.
But we are only not looking at the U.S. reason here. The Trump administration has called the deportees the worst of the worst. But more importantly then, why are the African countries accepting them? We've seen 8 have been deported to South Sudan and another 5 to Eswatini. Why are the African countries accepting this?
I think much of it has to do with leverage. There is no evidence that this thing is based on negotiations. It's extremely unpopular with African publics, and so countries are being literally blackmailed into actually accepting this. We remember South Sudan was very reluctant initially to accept immigrants who are not of the origin of South Sudanese, and as well as other countries. But because Washington has a lot of leverage for many, many years, both economic as well as security, they're using this, of course, to blackmail countries. But this is going to have domestic political implications for the governments in question, because this is an action. Not only does it violate international law, it's also extremely unpopular domestic audience of those countries that those people are being sent to.
Right, Dr. Lupuana, let me rope you in here, though. I want to hear your thoughts on this and the reason that the Trump administration is giving for deporting migrants to third countries. So far, 2 of them are in Africa, South Sudan and Eswatini. Your thoughts?
Let's start by, taking back to the question of the status of those who are being deported. So that is the important starting point to look at first. What are their status? Are they refugees? Are they undocumented? Illegal immigrant? Or this is just, criminal being transplanted? I would like to use that word, being transplanted, as my colleague have said it, This is the practice that was used during colonization and is still being used today. So when we go back and looking at their status under international law, that is where actually we're going to make this distinction to find out which law or international law can be used or has been used by Trump administration to transplant or to deport this group of people. But anyway, let's say, for example, that these are refugees. Those who have, seeking asylum or refugee in the U.S., there is a protection under international law, and international law on the protection of a refugee is really clear that the principle is non-refoulement. And the exception, there might be some exception under international law. For example, those who have committed crime can be perhaps because of a national security reason being deported, but then forcibly deportation, that is where the issue is. That is where the issue is. So we cannot, for example, even under international law, try now to determine the kind of processes that has been used correctly by the Trump administration.
Right. So, Dr. Kanenje, we're talking about what we've seen for countries like Eswatini and South Sudan, but other countries like Nigeria have refused to accede to the pressure and are pushing back against the idea. Why is that?
There are a number of reasons. One, Nigeria is a very big country and they have a lot more leverage when it comes to this, one of the largest economies on the continent. And so their voice is also big. And so countries such as Washington, for instance, may have less leverage when it comes to that. But also, I think Nigeria realizes, because of the role it plays on the continent, to accept something like that is to literally, accept to be treated less as a sovereign. Because remember, these are something that needs to be negotiated between sovereign powers. And to the extent that this is happening, considering Nigeria itself has millions, probably, of Nigerians in the United States, of course, it becomes dangerous, because what's going to happen tomorrow if, for instance, Washington uses the same leverage they used against South Sudan about revoking Nigerian visas, as a leverage, then it's going to be extremely dangerous. And I think Abuja has recognized that they need to be able to raise their voice as a sovereign country, that is not something that should be practiced in the 21st century.
David, let me hear your thoughts here on exactly why the Trump administration is deporting migrants, particularly to third countries in Africa. What is the reason being given not only to other third countries across the world, but particularly the ones to African countries?
The fact that a lot of African countries have asymmetrical relationships with the U.S. So by that I mean, if you take the case of Eswatini and South Sudan, these are some of the poorest countries, not only on the continent but in the world. So when a superpower, hegemonic power like the U.S. is negotiating or demanding, making these demands in the case of Trump, that these refugees should be taken, countries like South Sudan really have very little leverage, and many times, as we have seen, they will tend to cave in. But I must also add that there is a very underlying and sublime racial component to these deportations. If you'll realize, a lot of these migrants are from the global south, from either black or brown countries. Here we're thinking countries like Mexico, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Haiti, and they're also being deported to other global south countries, in this case, Sudan and Eswatini. So there's a really subtle racial components in terms of these deportations. We don't see undocumented migrants, and they are there, obviously at significantly less levels, from the UK in the US, from France, from Germany, and they are not being deported to Sudan or Eswatini. So I have to add, there is also a very subtle and cynical element to this, particularly when we think about how Trump campaigned on this immigration question. There was a fear within conservative ranks, within the Republican Party, that a lot of the immigration to the US, particularly since the 60s to the 90s, has been very much from the developing world, and the racial demographics of the US is changing. So in this dumping of undocumented immigrants back to their, to countries of the global south,
right,
it's almost like an effort to whiten, right, or re-whiten a population in the US, which by 2050 will be a majority minority country, meaning there'll be more brown or black people in the US than white people. So we cannot talk about this, conversation without also, also addressing some of the very, very obvious, racist and racial components that go into some of these immigration policies from Washington.
So, Dr. Lipwana, let's talk a little bit about the law here. What exactly does international law say about deportation of migrants to third countries?
International law is clear. The rule is non-refoulement, non-deportation, non-deportation. That is the rule. But then there are exceptions. When we look at, for example, at the UN Convention relating to the status of refugee, the 1951 Convention, and this is not the only instrument under international law. There are many other binding instruments, which the U.S. have ratified. We look at it, for example, the CAT Convention. So all these international law conventions are clear. So the principle is that a person who have been in a country, seeking refuge to a specific country, need the protection of that country. It is only under exceptional circumstances that such a person can be perhaps deported to another country. And this, among others, is for the issue that I've mentioned, for example, national security. But that is also after having taken into consideration all due processes, including court, trial, and even also giving the opportunity to the person to appeal. So what I'm trying to say here, if forcefully or forced deportation is not allowed under international law, because the international law, as it is when we look at it, for example, the convention that I've just mentioned here, the principle of non-discrimination, that is another point that we have also to look at into why a specific refugee or specific group of people need to be deported. Why only that? That also speak to the discrimination among the group of people or undocumented people who are in the U.S. or refugee people who are in the U.S.
Dr. Kanenje, but this is not the first time, though, that some foreign powers have tried to deport migrants to African countries. Last year, the UK Supreme Court ruled that a similar plan by the United Kingdom, to deport rejected asylum seekers to Rwanda was deemed illegal, right? But the US is now deporting to African countries. Why was the UK plan deemed illegal by the UK Supreme Court, but the US has been allowed?
Yeah, because there is something called American exceptionalism, and they do not think those kind of standards apply to them. Number two, it's important to understand that the Supreme Court today is actually controlled 6-3 by conservative Republicans who are hook and sinker with the Trump policy, especially immigration. So that's unlikely to happen when it comes to the U.S. Supreme Court. But fundamentally, the British system, considering also they have to accede to the European law, of course they understand the repercussions of that. But also the demographics of the UK in terms of governance, is different from the United States, which is majority either white Americans, and especially the Republican Party. Democrats are the ones who tend to have more minorities. And so that is not exactly the same when it comes to the UK. And so the history of the UK itself is different. Not to mention the UK has a lot of links with its former colonial powers or other colonial territories. And so to the extent that that failed there also communicates to the kind of engagement that the British public have, as well as the UK responsibilities to the rest of the world. This kind of restraint is not experienced in Washington, and especially when you have a Republican party under Trump in power, who believes in unilateralism and literally gets away with murder every day. Now, this is something of an anomaly. Unfortunately, it is something that is merging to actually become a norm, and not just in the United States, but increasingly in some other countries that are becoming more ultranationalist, and something that needs to be checked if we want to avoid going down a very dangerous path.
All right, gentlemen, on that note, let's take a short break. When we return, we'll try to make sense of why Africa is accepting U.S. deportees with criminal backgrounds and what this means for the continent. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's now continue with this discussion. Still with me, Hassan Kanenje, David Monda, and Kandala Lupuwama. Dr. Kanenje, let me go to you here first. Rwanda, Benin, Angola, Equatorial Guinea have been some of the countries, named in the media as potential recipient countries here. We do not know, though, what the deal breaking here, the deal making looks like. What is the deal making looking like? What is it that the U.S. is giving to these countries to allow them to get them to accept the deal?
One, Trump is very transactional. And the leadership of the countries mentioned, they also seem to be a type of leadership that have been desperate for Western recognition, and especially American embrace, in part either because they have controversial systems back home, or they don't feel extremely stable, or they are so tied to American corporate interest, and therefore it's going to be in their interest to be able to survive, to strike those deals. However, this kind of transactionalism is not something that is sustainable. I think Washington will be best advised to be able to build longer term engagements that can actually allow for sustainability. Now, what we are seeing is to the extent that the continent is becoming a dumping ground of America's worst, Not only do I echo the sentiment of my colleague, the highest form of racism, actually, but it demonstrates the continuity of extremely, perverted, apartheid kind of thinking when it comes to Africa, because we are not deporting these people even to their home countries, neither are we deporting them to Europe. Why should we not do that? And so I think it's a crisis of morality when it comes to African leadership, and especially those countries that are actually going to accept these immigrants. But we also understand that Washington, especially Trump, has a lot of leverage, in part because of the long years of engagement, economic, diplomatic and security that Washington still holds on the leadership of a number of these countries. One key thing that is common to all of them, they tend to be very small, with relatively smaller population and smaller economies, and therefore they're also very easy to beat around. As opposed, for instance, if they were dealing with Kenya, there's a lot more open, or Nigeria, or Egypt, or South Africa, I think the story will be different. And so they are being targeted in part because they are small, they are pliable, and they, in one way or another, they're dependent on the United States in greater levels that compared to perhaps other bigger, more advanced economies of the continent.
Dr. Kanyanyo, of course, African countries, we saw some outrage from Eswatini, human rights activists there asking questions. So what are the safety and legal concerns for these countries that the deportees are being taken to?
Yeah, first of all, and I do agree, the principle of non-refoulement, you cannot, first of all, force somebody to a country they don't even come from, or where they don't even feel safe. Neither can you guarantee their safety in that space. But I think critically, you're looking at serious human rights violations, not just of those who are being deported, because remember, some of these people have been accused. Maybe they've not been proven, yet. But then the others could be, serious, criminals who are doing that. Now, there's a danger to the host country or the receiving country when it comes to something like that, and history bears it. But also then the president that sets, how much is enough? Today you are accepting 10. What if tomorrow they want 1,000? Remember, there are 12 million illegal immigrants in the United States. So where are they going to go? Are they all going to be dumped in your country? What will be the socio-political repercussions within your space? Considering that a lot of these countries do not have enough resources or capacity to actually take care of these people, perhaps beyond a few months or a few years. Reason, because they have so many other problems and so many other needs to attend to. And so, so the civil society members who are raising this, I think they have legitimate concerns about that. But, this is something that should not happen to start with. And I think it's a message to African countries that they need to diversify their interests to ensure that they're not subject and extremely vulnerable to one big, bully, such as, for instance, the Trump administration was trying to do.
So many are going to be looking at whether Africa is going to be speaking on one voice in this issue. And David, the issue of the migrants came up in Trump's recent meeting with 5 African leaders in Washington, D.C. Is this something African countries should engage in bilaterally, or should the African Union have a say?
I think if it's a position from African decision makers, I think they should engage Trump as a unit through the African Union. A lot of international law and international humanitarian law and refugee law has been domesticated within African constitutions through the AU Charter, and through a range of international conventions on refugees and on immigrants' rights. So I think using multilateral frameworks and using the offices of the AU, I think, would be the way to go. However, the Trump administration is very cunning and skillful, not only in terms of relating to Africa, but as we see, even the European Union and other countries around the world. The trap here for a lot of African countries is a lot of these transactional deals that are bilateral are not transparent, they're not open, they usually tend to violate international law. And more importantly, transactional deals tend to infer material gain for both parties involved. But when we talk about immigrants and refugees and migrants, we can never forget the story of the individuals that are involved. These are human beings. These are individual stories of women, children, and men who are in really, really horrible conditions. And we've not even talked about the stateless people, right? The people who have no national passport or identity. And when these transactional deals are being done, we sometimes tend to forget, the human story behind it. So for issues of transparency, for issues of human rights, I think for issues of human dignity, African countries should really go through the AU and engage with the US through the African Union rather than bilaterally as individual states.
Right. So, gentlemen, I want to get your closing remarks. And let me start off with you, Dr. Lupuama. Are African countries surrendering their sovereignty by accepting these deportation deals? And what do you see as the option here?
It's time again that African Union take the lead instead of allowing individual countries to deal with Trump. So if African Union can take the lead and have a common position to protect their, country's sovereignty. This is what actually our forefathers died for. With the independence around 1960, somewhere there, the first issue or the first objective of the African Union at the time, the Organization of African Unity, was to be independent, to protect the sovereignty of African countries. So now it's time that, African Union take the lead to protect, African, because what are we going to see? The threat to a specific country will be a threat to other African countries. So if, for example, criminal, let me put it that way, have been deported to a specific African country, that become a threat not only to that specific country, but to the entire Africa. So we have to, deal with it at the African Union level.
Right. David, your thoughts?
I'd like to end on an optimistic note. In East Africa, we say mtafutaji hachoki, which is in Swahili says that he that seeks does not tire. And I think in this context, African states and the African Union really need to reemphasize international law and international principles and multilateral frameworks of global cooperation on migration. Because as time has gone on, international borders have tended to become less and less important, and countries tend to have to cooperate with each other as the world has become more of a global village. So mtafutaji hachoki, we need to renew this effort for those that are seeking change to continually work to re-emphasize multilateral frameworks rather than this unilateralist, hegemonic, dictatorial Trumpism, which seems to be the new mantra in terms of the new international order.
Dr. Kanyenje, your final word.
I think acquiescing to Trump's very predatory foreign policy comes to Africa is tantamount for us going back to being slaves again. And if we are going to live the dream of African solutions to African problems, then I think we need to increase agency within regional as well as continental organizations to ensure that this kind of overreach actually does not continue. Because if left unchecked, there is a lot more bad things that are going to happen. And I think it's time that the continent woke up, because it's not happening to other parts of the world, but it's become so easy because we are a path of least resistance for Donald Trump.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much for your insights. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Hassan Kanyenje, Director at the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, David Monda, Professor, Political Science Department, City University of New York, and Kandala Lupuana, International Law Expert. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, goodbye.